My name is Alaister Moughan. I've worked in the music industry over the past decade across different record labels, music publishers, and in the financial sector. I specialize in the valuation of music catalogs and run my own consulting company called Moughan Music, where I advise artists, songwriters, producers, and investors. For the past 4 years, I've advised on over $4 billion worth of transactions, working with artists, producers, labels, and publishers who are considering selling their catalog, as well as investors who are looking to buy catalogs and larger complex financial transactions and securitizations. One example of some of the clients I work with is the Jonas Group, who is Kevin Jonas Sr., the father and manager of the Jonas Brothers. I advised Kevin as he's looking to expand his management business to own songwriter and producer catalog. I worked closely with Kevin to acquire the catalog of Julia Michaels, who is a singer-songwriter known for writing for the likes of Justin Bieber, Selena Gomez, Dua Lipa. I was a junior lawyer in New Zealand looking to get involved in the music business. For me, the best way to do that was to leave New Zealand and move to New York, there to study a master's in music business at NYU, more relevantly, intern and get some first-hand experience from the ground up. And was fortunate to have some great internship experience at companies like Reservoir Media Management, Domino Records, and The Orchard. After that, I went on to work for a music publisher called In Grooves in New York and spent some time at different labels and business affairs roles in the UK at Sony and Universal. Through having a variety of experience in music publishing at labels and in the legal part of the business, I managed to land a role heading up the music department at a finance company in London who are looking to invest into the music sector. That's where I got my taste of the music catalog world. After 3 to 4 years at that company, I started my own business offering those services myself. I was very fortunate that I had 7 or 8 internships and worked in different parts of the business and then used that to work out where my skills worked best. Originally, being a lawyer, I was quite focused on legal roles, but the more I got exposed to music publishing, the more that it interests me and also the financial aspect and how the legal rights flow into that. And that was one of my first internships at Reservoir, where I was originally the legal intern because they were doing a number of large acquisitions. They needed some help with the publishing data that I, by chance, started working on publishing catalogs, and that's how I got onto it. It's very much by trial and error and learning what these areas of the industry meant. A lot of it was learning practically. In terms of the clients I work with, one group is working with sellers. That might be an artist, a songwriter, a record label, or a music publisher. They might be considering a sale. They might want a valuation of their catalog to raise money to expand their company. When I'm working with a seller, usually they're represented by a manager or a lawyer. That could be a long-term process as I value their catalog over 6 months and get different data from them. Secondly, the Jonas Group is an example. It's working with financial investors. That may be working with catalog buyers. I do a lot of work with different banks who lend against music catalogs. They have a big group of clients I work with is investors and lenders. There's also other types of clients I advise for valuation for many reasons. It might be litigation, it might be divorce, it might be hundreds of millions of dollar transaction where there's securitization and one of the ratings agency needs some advice on the valuations. It's either a seller, an investor, or all other, where there's often unusual circumstances where valuations are needed. It looks different and it's very stop and start because the catalog valuation process requires a lot of information, so it can take a while to get them. Generally, the artist or the label who's been represented, they need to have built up a catalog. That means they have a catalog which is at least 10 years old on average. So the songs or the top tracks are at least 10 years old. It's a better time to sell the catalog when it's more aged because the price will be higher. Typically, it's a rights owner who's later in life and is looking at doing some estate or tax planning, but it depends on the circumstances. Whenever I talk to a seller, is there's a strategic reason for them to sell, whether that be that they're later in life and they're trying to plan what the next 20 years looks like in terms of managing that legacy, or if they're a younger artist, they need some capital to start a business or they want to start their own publishing company. I always think that rather than it being the right time to sell the catalog based on the catalog, it's based on the needs of the owner. Often these big catalog sale can happen and then the artist or the rights owners doesn't actually know what they're going to do with that lump sum. It's very much taking your investment out of your catalog and into something else, or doing it for planned reasons. If it's a strong catalog and there's not a need to have a big influx of capital, there's nothing wrong with sitting back and watching that catalog grow. From my perspective, I think it's the reality that it is a very detailed process. There's a lot of information required. You're going to need 3 to 5 years of royalty statements. You need all of the legal agreements governing the catalog. It's quite a long process to get all that information. Some buyers might say they can close very quickly within a couple of months. The process from getting all that information to getting it over to the buyer understanding it, to the lawyers looking at the offer agreement, the lawyers looking at all the agreements governing the catalog, to more information coming in, that takes quite a long time, even if both parties are willing to go. My caution is be realistic about how long it's going to take. I would highly recommend that the seller gets tax advice, very good understanding of how the transaction is going to be taxed and what the after-tax proceeds of the transaction will look like, and they're planning on what they're going to do with that money, because that's the most common challenge that I see when people sell catalogs, is that they aren't prepared for what the actual number is going to look like in their bank account at the end of the day. It could take 3 to 4 weeks for me to do some valuations, but that's from the date of having all of the data that I require. Purely doing a valuation, that's something I can turn around quite quickly. It's just in the sale process, that's the thing which takes longer rather than the valuation itself. It can really differ by catalog, as well as there being more investors in music catalogs in general. The other thing which has become a trigger for these transactions is that in a digital world, there's a lot of requirement to manage the digital legacy of an artist. Artists that don't have social media, even if it's literally not having a social media page, can be impacted on streaming success. Some of these companies that have active investment strategies are looking to help with that legacy management part of the equation. It's really hard to know whether your catalog's going to blow up and have a social media moment. It's similar to syncs in a catalog where it's hard to pick when something's going to happen, but songs which have a certain popularity or represent a certain era have that opportunity to go viral. It's something which people are now considering, how you manage the digital legacy of a business. While in the past it was more passive. In terms of the trend, when I started in the music publishing world, predominantly the only catalogs that sold, and only transactions that was going on were music publishers buying evergreen copyrights. So when you say evergreen, you mean publishing catalogs of writers, specifically only writers rather than recording rights. The songs were over 30 or 40 years old. And it was these music publishers who want to expand their business. And anything outside that world might sell, but there wasn't really an active market. That's really changed where now you have buyers who will buy master rights or passive rights that don't have any copyright interests. They'll buy single tracks. There's more access for people to sell catalogs. In terms of who it makes sense for, I think you have a strategic reason to sell, like why you need that lump sum rather than waiting for the short-term gains. It can really differ by the artist's need. The work that I do for a seller is to not only to give you a number, but to show this is how the buyer is looking at your catalogs. I think that's the part I like. If it makes sense, if an artist is selling a couple of tracks because they want to use that to fund their next album and it's really successful, then that's a great story. But if they're selling it and then they don't use it for anything productive, then it's a lost asset. It is a very new tool that music fans can become investors. I think it's great to give that liquidity to artists who might not have been able to sell their catalogs in the past. I think it's quite an exciting tool for music fans to be able to own a share of songs. It's yet to be proven how much they could influence those songs. If you own a part of a song, how much can you make that different? That's the exciting wrinkle in it. But it just really is opening up that world to catalogs in the past, which were not available to be able to be sold. It's very new as well, so it'll be interesting to see how that progresses. It's bringing a lot of exposure to the music royalties, where in the past it was all behind closed doors and in private. I worked in finance for 3 or 4 years, and it was my job to explain the music business and how royalties work to bankers, and that is a very complex thing to describe, and it's a thing that you have to describe over and over again. And there's so much complexity in platforms where you're making shares available to the public. I've gone through all those loopholes because music is something which is really easy for people to understand in terms of you stream a song on Spotify, that gets a royalty. You hear it on the TV, that gets a royalty. You're in a cafe, that cafe pays the license fees, a royalty goes to the artist. But when you go into the detail of how that gets paid, that's just so
Mm,
complex. That's
yeah.
something that was really hard to show them anything because everything was private. But now you have these platforms where you can look at, they have catalogs for sale and you can see how the earnings are and get more of a view. That's the interesting part, is a lot of that, which is always super private, is somewhat public. But in saying that, it is usually smaller artists. So all of these big transactions, any of the huge Springsteen, Dylan, Paul Simon, Queen catalogs, it's hard to get any sense of any realistic stuff behind the numbers. I'd always say that there's the master side of the recording side and the music publishing side, the songwriting side. I'd always think about those two things separately. So there's now a lot of music distributors out there. So I'll try to stay with one distributor and publisher rather than multiple if possible. The only real reason to switch distributors is that they're willing to give you a big advance. Trying to keep it simple does make life easier. And the hardest catalogs I deal with is where there's multiple distributors and multiple publishers. It's always good when you have a distributor or publisher who have their email address of someone you can contact to get any response and to understand if, for example, if you notice one of your songs is not available in the territory, or if something gets taken down, or if you have a question around royalties. Working with the distributors where you can have a point of contact can make a really big difference. That is one of those things you can do DIY. It gets very difficult when you have multiple distributors and publishers. And an artist that has a career of 50 years, that just might be realistic that you change record labels and that's how it works. But if you're starting out, I'd always encourage trying to keep it simple. Being strategic around decisions, especially for an artist catalog, but even for a label. Catalogs in the digital world are never really defunct. They always have to have a presence in a positive way. You can also look at potentially selling your catalog and understanding the value, understanding where the income streams are, having your catalog organized so that in the future, yourself or someone else can manage that digital legacy. I've seen a lot of circumstances where a catalog can be inherited by a family member. They don't have any ideas around those instructions, or they don't have any knowledge of the music business. That can often be where bad decisions are made because of the lack of understanding. All these things coming in, and I don't know what sync licenses, or I don't know what kind of licensing they would like, or I don't have the Facebook login. Like, these days can be really hard to figure out. Always being organized and having a point in time in your career where if you've built up a catalog, you stop and try to get everything organized and have everything in one place and have an understanding of what that value is, so that at least you have a guidebook of how you want that legacy to be run and how to operate it, because it is a particular niche world. I've found a good role for myself working with an artist's manager and their lawyer and their business managers, because as you said, they have an understanding of those things, but managers always think about the next project, and they're thinking about how we're getting a deal for the next album or for the tour. It's a very different proposition from looking back. What are all the agreements that govern all the catalog? How much has the catalog brought in for the last 5 years? So these are things which don't really fit the role of any of the advisors and artist teams. That's often how I get involved, because it is a very arduous task and it's not something you think about every day. What was the royalties from that distribution deal we had 10 years ago? Because you're trying to think about, well, how do we get more work, not let's look back in the past. So that's difficult, especially for like an artist of 50 years, is that naturally the manager's always looking to the next things. It would make sense for managers or lawyers of artists, also any large independent record labels or music publishers like to connect with, and of course any investors in the space or companies that are looking to expand as well.